you have the regulatory agencies to worry about, you may, and probably will, be subject to a toxic tort suit. If the norm in your industry is to have an environmental management system, it is very likely that the opposition's attorney will argue that your company's failure to have implemented an EMS was a direct or at least contributing cause of the accident. What the lawyer is attempting to have the judge or jury do is to establish a standard of care, the violation of which is negligence on the part of your company. Thus, in industries where EMSs are common, the lack of an EMS can create a dangerous situation from a liability standpoint. Conversely, the existence of an EMS is evidence that your company made every effort to avoid that environmental incident. Finally, trade barriers can be diminished with ISO 14001. ISO 14001 establishes internationally recognized standards that will diminish barriers to trade and make it easier to do business across borders, both for importing and exporting companies and for multinationals that operate worldwide. The standardized system also promises to make it easier for companies to gauge their environmental performance and make useful comparisons of facilities in different countries. Arthur D. Little surveyed executives at 115 large North American businesses. They found that 61% expected ISO 14001 to bring potential competitive advantage. In addition, 48% said that failure to board the bandwagon could constitute a potential non-tariff trade barrier, given their expectation that customers around the world will require it. Thus, ISO 14001 may result in the loss of a company's competitiveness and the emergence of barriers to trade where standards are not adopted. However, for those who adopt the standard, ISO 14001 could be an important shield against unfair trade practices. The next issue I want to discuss are the unique legal aspects of ISO 14001 in the United States. ISO 14001 is an internationally recognized standard for the development and implementation of environmental management systems. It encompasses a broad goal for the systematization of continuous improvement of an organization's environmental impacts. However, because ISO 14001 was developed through international consensus, it may, in many respects, fail to recognize or be sensitive to the specific regulatory environment of each participating nation. This is particularly significant in countries such as the United States, which have a long tradition of legislative regulation in the environmental arena. The transition enabled by ISO 14001 does have its conflicts. ISO 14001 provides organizations with an opportunity to make that transition from traditional command and control, strict liability regulation, to a full disclosure, self-regulation mode. This transition is supported by many regulators as well as members of the regulated community. Unfortunately, the United States Congress and many state legislatures have enshrined command and control in existing laws and regulations. Thus, this transition from the current command and control model to a full self-disclosure regulation model creates legal conflicts. Specifically, there are 5 hot-button legal issues that organizations must address to make that transition between these two regulatory models. Organizations who are cognizant of these issues and plan to address them will succeed in making the transition. Those who ignore these issues do so at their own peril. The first legal issue is the initial environmental review. Initial environmental review is that procedure through which a company evaluates its current environmental management system and compares that system to the requirements of the ISO 14001 standard. The initial environmental review audits for the existence and operability of each element of the ISO 14001 standard. As an example, ISO 14001 requires that an organization adopt an environmental policy, and that that policy include certain specific components. During the initial environmental review, the organization identifies the existence or non-existence of an environmental policy. It then compares that policy to specific criteria required by the ISO 14001 standard. The same procedure is followed for other elements of the standard. The results of the initial environmental review are the basis then for evaluating the organization's current environmental management system and for integrating it into an ISO 14001 registrable system. Initial environmental review frequently raises two legal issues. First, the process may identify prior acts that constitute regulatory violations. Second, it may identify existing procedural deficiencies that could result in future regulatory noncompliances. The second legal issue to consider when making the transition between regulatory modes is the environmental policy. ISO 14001, Section 4.2, requires registered organizations to define their environmental policy. The wording of subsection C, requiring commitment to comply with applicable regulations and other requirements, reflects the goal to commitment to complete compliance, but not necessarily a guarantee of 100% compliance. This phrasing reflects the complex and sometimes overwhelming nature of the environmental regulations in the United States, where, according to many experts, it is impossible for an organization to be in complete compliance with all regulations at all times. Thus, the policy statement must walk that fine line between the aspirational goal of complete compliance and a representation that compliance is always complete. Another issue is the requirement that the policy be available to the public. Not only does this make the document discoverable, it also constitutes a representation upon which others may rely. Failure to implement the policy may therefore constitute misrepresentation, thus creating liability for the organization to persons who foreseeably relied on the policy. Those persons might include stockholders, lenders, insurers, neighbors, environmental groups, and a multitude of other stakeholders. The third legal issue is identification of legal requirements and voluntary standards. Section 4.3.2 of ISO 14001 requires that a registered organization identify and have access to applicable legislation, regulatory, and other environmental requirements to which the organization subscribes. However, because ISO 14001 was created by international consensus, it does not identify the specific qualifications of the individuals charged with this responsibility. This results in substantial debate within the U.S. environmental community concerning the specific qualifications of the individuals who may be charged with this responsibility. Additionally, the identification of legal and voluntary environmental standards that obligate an organization include considerations of time, geography, and scope. Statutes and voluntary commitments change over time. Thus, it is essential to regularly review those obligations as part of an ISO 14001 environmental management system. Many environmental statutes and regulations are also geographically specific. Laws change from one state to another. Air quality requirements may vary from an attainment district to a non-attainment district. Thus, organizations with multiple facilities need to identify and make available the laws and regulations applicable to each geographic location. This issue also arises for organizations moving from one geographic location to another. Within the same geographic location and during the same time period, the rules and regulations that impact an organization will also vary based on the size and complexity of that organization. It is important that organizations conduct facility-specific reviews to ensure the regulatory scope is appropriate for that specific organization. The fourth legal issue that must be considered during the transition involves self-evaluation and compliance and system audits. Strict adherence to ISO 14001 standard does not expressly require that an organization audit for environmental compliance. Rather, the standard requires that the organization establish a method for determining the rules and regulations which are applicable to it, and then developing a management system to ensure compliance with those rules and regulations. Thus, in theory, ISO 14001 auditors should look for the existence of a management system for compliance, rather than compliance with specific environmental rules and regulations. This narrow view has been rejected by many ISO 14001 auditors and registrars. Real-world realities require that in order to measure the effectiveness of a compliance management system, auditors must look at environmental compliance itself. By analogy, a certified public accountant cannot effectively audit an organization's financial management system by looking only at its written procedures. Ultimately, the accountant must look at the checkbook for evidence of compliance with those procedures. The underlying necessity to consider an organization's compliance history has led to a bundle of legal issues. They include the duty to disclose and the applicability of a series of privileges and immunities. The fifth legal issue is the management review. The final element of ISO 14001 is management review. The management review addresses the possible need for changes in policies, objectives, and targets considered in the EMS. In light of the EMS audit results, changing circumstances, and a commitment to continual improvement. The standard further provides that the organization's top management shall, at intervals that it determines, review the EMS to ensure its continuing suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. Part of the management review process ensures that necessary information is collected for the evaluation to take place. Finally, that review must be documented. This important component of the ISO 14001 EMS is also one of the great concerns to the legal community. It provides outside parties with what has sometimes been called a litigation roadmap. By examining and documenting conclusions concerning the effectiveness and efficiency of an organization's EMS, senior management provides in a single document the information that plaintiffs require for civil or criminal litigation. While these documents may, in some jurisdictions, be privileged or covered under some immunity legislation, they remain legal dynamite. Today we have discussed legal benefits to be derived by organizations that adopt ISO 14001. These include greater access to capital, reduced civil and criminal liabilities, increased market share, higher profits, and a better environment for today and tomorrow. We have also discussed some of the legal issues raised by the transition from command and control regulation to third-party audited self-regulation. These issues include self-evaluation and compliance audits, policy development, and management review. As we begin to implement ISO 14001, legal issues surrounding the transition from traditional command and control to full disclosure self-regulation remain unresolved. But as we have seen, implementing environmental management systems have clear legal advantages. ISO 14000 is the wave of the future. Those who embrace it can look forward to rising profits in a global economy. Those who ignore it do so at their peril. While many of the legal issues concerning the implementation of ISO 14001 remain unresolved, implementation of environmental management systems has clear legal advantages. By demonstrating a commitment to continuous environmental improvement, ISO 14001 serves to shield the company, its directors, officers, and employees from allegations of negligent or reckless behavior by investors, stockholders, regulators, and the general public. By reducing these potential liabilities, companies that adopt ISO 14001 will see substantial benefits, including an increase in market share, environmental awareness, and stock value in conjunction with a decrease in borrowing costs, insurance costs, and general liability defense costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenbaum. Now let's continue with the second question and answer session. Our first question comes to you via fax from Technological Institute de Acapulco in Mexico. And since the ISO 14000 has become the nationally accepted environmental management system, there has been some confusion on how to publicize the ISO 9000 or ISO 14000 certification. Could we discuss this very briefly? Wayne?
Well, certainly you need to speak with both your registrar and your auditor. The ISO 9000 and 14000 logos are copyrighted items and can only be used as defined by the owners. And therefore, yes, you may use it in some forms of advertising. You may not use it on your products. This is something you need to work through with your registrar.
Okay. Our question comes from KTV in Rio de Janeiro.
Hello, good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Considering that the environment comprises many intangible factors, are there any requirements for environmental damages that are required by the ISO 14001?
Ooh, that sounds like a question for Wayne. Wayne?
Well, actually, I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer, because what I think we're really looking at is identifying aspects and impacts. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's right. Actually, in terms of damages, one of the things that the ISO 14001 standard will require that you do is go through your operation and your facility and identify environmental aspects. And the next step beyond that is to figure out which of those aspects actually have a significant impact on the environment. Now, you've got some flexibility in terms of how you define significant, whether you want to use terms like environmental damage or whatnot. But that is how that particular issue has been incorporated into the standard.
Thank you, Jennifer. Our next question comes from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva.
The question is, in the absence of detailed data on environmental costs, and given the lack of standardized environmental performance indicators, how can the impact of ISO 14000 on the financial performance be measured with any certainty?
Any certainty? That seems to be the big question. I think, Wayne, you alluded a little bit to ROI earlier.
Well, yes, and there have been some studies. I think the best one that we have now is the ICF Kaiser study on environmental management systems and stock value. Now, certainly one can argue that that is a perception rather than a reality, and I believe we're going to have to gather more data over time. But at this point, we have seen at least some anecdotal work and some studies like ICF Kaiser that tend to make the correlation, tend to make the linkage.
Okay. Thank you, Wayne. Our next question comes from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, Facultad de Medicina en México.
Sí, diga. Bueno, la pregunta, por favor. Good morning. The question is there any record of quality control for education, and what is the educational institution in Latin America that has adopted ISO 14000?
Seems we have a Latin American related question. Would any of you want to tackle that one?
You know, unfortunately at this point, I'm not aware of any. Wayne, are you familiar with any?
No, I'm not.
Yeah.
This is a new area. We have heard of some organizations here in the United States, educational organizations, but I certainly don't know of any in Latin America as yet.
I know here in the United States that there are groups in the ISO 9000 arena that is setting up their standards for the education arena. Are there any more questions? Our next question comes from the Universidad Central de Venezuela, Caracas.
Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity at the Universidad Central. What part of the ISO 14000 standard forces compliance of the environmental protection, especially when Latin American countries are affected by residues that are hazardous and come from industrialized countries? And what are the legal recourses that could be obtained in order to comply with this regulation? Thank you.
Seems like there's a 2 or 3 pronged question. Again, it's legal, Wayne. I think forces and repercussions are the key.
Yes, you know, without a whole bunch of facts, it's very difficult to in fact, inappropriate to render sort of a legal opinion. However, the one thing we can say about the standard is it sets a societal standard. It provides an ability for an organization to say, look, we're doing it right. And I believe that ultimately people are going to want to do business and trade with those types of organizations.
Thank you, Wayne. Our next question comes from the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, CPEC, in Mexico.
I would like to congratulate you for your great concepts at this video conference. The Paulina hurricane caused a lot of death and material damages in the Pacific coasts in our country, Mexico. This punishment has to do with the damages that we have caused to the environment and the lack of respect that we have shown to nature. And so how can we not provoke these forces? And as a suggestion, and to support and adhere to this video conference, I request to get in contact and in coordination with some organization in order to protect the environment in the Paracho municipality in Michoacán. Thank you.
I think if you would leave the information with our operator, someone here I'm sure will be forwarding that information to the correct respondents, and we'll get right back to you. At this time, I'd like to say thank you for your excellent questions. You both have been tremendous in it. And I would like to just again thank Mr. Kraus and Ms. Rosenbaum, Mr. Rosenbaum, for sharing their thoughts and the ideas with us in this program. We would also like to say thank you to all the viewers for their participation. We will continue transmitting programs on the latest developments to increase global competitiveness. We invite you to participate November 13th on our next program of our series entitled Visioning Organizational Successes, Competing for the Future. For additional information on the International Training Center's programs for this year, please consult your participants manual where you will find the dates and specific topics for these. Also, if you are interested in participating in training programs which will be offered by the International Training Center, please contact the center by letter, phone, fax, or email. On behalf of all of us who collaborate with the International Training Center, I thank you for your participation and interest in today's program. Thank you, and see you soon.